Hello learners, welcome back again. We will continue our discussion of Anita Desai's Clear Light of Day. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, we will first spend some time with the textual analysis of the part 1 of the novel. In the previous lecture, I briefly summarized the events that unfold in this part, and I introduced some of the themes that the narrator treats by describing those events. In this lecture, I will continue describing more of the events that unfold in part 1, and I will conclude with an extensive discussion of the themes that these events help us understand. The key thing that happens in the second half of part 1 is that the narrator answers a question which was implied in the first half of part 1. This question is what happens? Rather, what had happened in the past which makes things so that Bim and Tara remember the past so differently. In other words, part 1 helped us understand a fact, which is that Bim and Tara, being so close and being sisters and having experienced more or less the same things as children, have very different attitudes towards that past. This was a fact that we understood in part 1 and which I talked about in the previous lecture. I will now talk about how the narrator answers a question that emerges from a description of that fact, which is, okay, they seem to have different attitudes towards the past, but why do they have different attitudes about the past? What happened in the past which predisposes these two sisters to think about the same events in such radically different ways? To answer that question, the narrator also describes to us how Bim and Tara became these two different human beings that they are today. So you can see how, as the novel progresses, the narrator provides us with more and more information. The narrator helps us understand the full complexity of what these two individuals are. The narrator provides us with that complexity by first letting us understand that same events are remembered in different ways. Both Bim and Tara remember things, but these things have different shapes in the respective imaginations of these two sisters. The first thing that they both recall with different attitudes is their brother's admiration and appreciation for writing poems. Now, Tara has an extremely sympathetic, almost affectionate view of what their brother Raja used to do. Tara says to Bim, "And do you remember Raja marching up and down here on the roof, swinging his arms and reciting his poems to us, while we sat there on the balustrade, swinging our legs and listening? I used to feel like crying. It was so beautiful, those poems about death and love and wine and flames." Now, in response to this very, very nostalgic, affectionate, and loving memory that is expressed by Tara, Bim provides a very harsh and almost critical and almost brutal response. Bim says, "They weren't. They were terrible," Bim said icily, tossing her head with a stubborn air like a bad-tempered mare's. "Terrible verses," he wrote. Now, this is the beginning of what will become the tenor of the novel. I call this the tenor of the novel because the narrator frequently straddles these two attitudes. The first attitude is one of longing for the past. And we can all understand that attitude because we all at some point have longed for the past. That sense comes from a very obvious knowledge that life is short, that all the good things will be over soon, that no one lives forever, and the quality of our life is frequently degrading. With every passing second, we are aging, and we are losing the ability to enjoy and appreciate all of the things that we once enjoyed and appreciated while we were young. That is a very obvious human tendency to long for what was, to value what was in the past, to think that the past was beautiful and ideal and the present is no longer so. So the narrative frequently indulges this very human weakness. But the narrator also engages a different tendency, which is a very scientific and objective and cold hearted, almost clinical and almost technical view of the imperfections of the past. What is that sense? That is a realistic sense which acknowledges that there were many problems in the way things were in the past, and that even though we have lost our innocence and our ability to live life in a simple way, we have also gained many things, right? So, to fully appreciate what we have gained in the present, we are forced to acknowledge that the past was not perfect. Now, that is a sense that BIM has very strongly, and this will come in a much more stronger way later when we understand how BIM operates as a professional historian. BIM's job is a teacher of history. BIM reads books by historians of India. BIM reads testimonies, memoirs, and autobiographies of historically important characters like kings and common men from ancient India. BIM also reads books by other historians who have described the lives of these people from the past. As a historian, then, BIM is not predisposed to the kind of glorifying of the past that Tara engages in. So, this difference between the two sisters also reflects the different kinds of upbringing that these two women have had. It also reflects the different paths that were available to women of this class in that part of India's history. The path that Tara takes is the path of many women, which is to give up education and professional pursuits and instead to devote their labor and time and energy to the keeping up of the household, to raising children and to taking care of people. That is the path that Tara has chosen. BIM, however, has chosen a slightly different path, which is to not give in to marriage or to not start a conventional family, which is to say, a heterosexual nuclear family, that is to say, with a husband and children, but rather to take care of the people that she was entrusted with from her natal family, that is to say, her younger brother, her aunt, people in her family, animals and plants in her mother's house. These are the people and creatures for whom Bin cares for. And in order to support herself, Bin follows a professional path. She becomes a teacher and historian of literature. So these are the different paths that these two women have taken. Now, perhaps because Bim is a professional historian, she shoots down this kind of idealizing talk that Tara voices when she says that Raja's poems are beautiful. Right? And Bim says that these poems were actually terrible. And Bim explains why Tara should actually acknowledge that these poems were terrible. Bim says, of course it was, Tara, terrible, terrible. We're not 15 and 10 years old anymore, you and I. Have you tried reading it recently? It's nauseating. Can you remember any two lines of it that wouldn't make you sick with embarrassment now? So what is Bim doing here? Bim is not saying that Tara should be harsh towards her own brother. Bim is saying that you can display your affection and love as much as you want, but always be clear about certain facts. And what are the facts? The facts are that at the time that Raja wrote those verses of Urdu poetry, the verses that Tara says were beautiful, which were about death and love and wine. These two sisters were 10 and 15 years old. Therefore, they did not have a critical, objective, and intellectual and thorough sense with which they could appreciate what was good or bad poetry. The only sense that they had was that they loved their brother. Now, that may not be the most accurate academic resource with which to evaluate the quality of writing. That is Bim's point. As 10 and 15-year-old girls, they could appreciate and fall in love with those poems. However, at this point, at the time that Bim and Tara are talking about their past, they are not 10 and 15 years old anymore. They are in their 30s or 40s. That is left vague. The narrative does not provide us with exact information, but we can assume that they are in their middle age, early to late middle age. Being people of this age, they have a much greater, a much more objective, a much more holistic sense of appreciating what good or bad writing is. They are equipped with the sense of right, wrong, and the ability to discern quality. With that knowledge, with that experience, they should not go back to what they were when they were 10 and 15 years old. So it is therefore wrong, in Bimla's perspective, for Tara to still believe what she believed when she was 10 years old. Now, this difference of opinion about the quality of the verses and the poems that their brother Raja had written when they were children brings the two sisters to a revelation. This is a key turning point in the novel. This moment actually reveals to us the conflict, the frustration, and the crisis at the heart of the novel. How does this happen? When Bim convinces Tara that Raja's poems were actually bad, she wants to provide evidence to Tara. She wants to show Tara the poems so that Tara can really understand what Bim is talking about. So she goes into her room, pulls out all her old papers, and starts looking for some of these copies of these poems. In addition to copies of these old poems, Bimla also finds another document which she has kept in a very special place, and she shows it to Tara. This document is not a poem but a letter. It's a letter that Raja, their elder brother, had written to Bimla at some point. I'm going to read the whole letter now, and then I will talk about why this is so important for us to understand the novel. In the letter, Raja writes, "You will have got our wire with the news of Hyder Ali Saab's death. I know you will have been as saddened by it as we are. Perhaps you are also a bit worried about the future. But you must remember that when I left you, I promised I would always look after you, Bim. When Hyder Ali Saab was ill and making out his will, Benazir herself spoke to him about the house and asked him to allow you to keep it at the same rent we used to pay him when mother and father were alive. He agreed. You know he never cared for money, only for friendship. And I want to assure you that now that he is dead and has left all his property to us, you may continue to have it at the same rent. I shall never think of raising it or of selling the house as long as you and Baba need it. If you have any worries, Bim, you have only to tell. Raja." So think about why this letter should be important. What we learn from Bim's words to Tara is that this letter is the reason that she hates Raja. Since she received this letter, she has cut off all her ties with her brother. She has refused to talk to her brother since he wrote his letter to her. Now think about what in this letter may have produced that reaction in Bimla. What Raja is saying is, that he has inherited the house in which Bimla, his sister, lives as a tenant. How did this happen? We will learn more about this in the future, but what has happened is that Raja, Bimla's brother, married the daughter of the landowner. That is, the owner was Hyder Ali Saab, who owned a lot of property in that area of Old Delhi. At some point, Raja, who was the son of Hyder Ali's tenant, married Hyder Ali's daughter, Benazir. Due to this marriage, Raja inherited all the property that Hyder Ali Saab owned, including the house which these siblings called home, the house in which they grew up. Therefore, after the death of Hyder Ali Saab, Bim has become her brother's tenant in a technical sense. Now, in this situation, what her brother has decided to do as a landowner is that he has written a letter assuring her, that is his sister and tenant, that he will never raise the rent, that he will keep the rent at the same rate that it was when they were children. Now, the tone in which Raja promises to take care of his sister comes across as highly condescending and highly intimidating to Bimla, his sister. Now, it is that tone which upsets Bimla so much that she refuses to talk to her own brother and she has cut off all ties. Now, it's important that this scene is described by the narrator at the end of part 1 of the novel. This is important because it reveals to us the problem at which we stand. This is the crisis that is afflicting the heart and soul of Bimla as a person. This is a crisis because she loves her family, she loves her siblings, and yet, despite that love that she bears for her family, she is forced to not talk to them. She is refusing and is unable to maintain cordial, warm, familial ties with her sibling and his family. When Tara sees this letter, she realizes that Raja has done something wrong. She understands why Bimla is refusing to talk to her own brother. Her immediate response is to ask Bimla to forget and forgive. Bimla says that she will never forget and will never forgive this kind of a sin. Now, why is this such a grave sin in Bimla's eyes? What is unforgivable about this letter? Now, in order to understand that, you need to understand how Bimla cares for her family and how she feels that her labor of care is not recognized by her family. The unforgivable aspect of Raja's letter is that Raja assumes that Bim will always be there to provide the care, to take care of the family and all of the attendant creatures that were in the family. And the fact that Raja mentions the rent along with Bimla's care means that in some way Raja equates Bimla's care with the furniture, with the immovable property in that estate. And that sense is highly frustrating and condescending to Bimla. We will return to that theme later on in the novel, but for now let us move forward and try to understand all that happens in part 1 of this novel. A very important scene unfolds in the second half of part 1, which is a scene when the two sisters and Bakul are visiting their neighbors, a family that is identified simply by their last name, the Mishras. In this dinner party, a lot of the Indian people in the Mishra household ask many questions of Tara's husband, whose name is Bakul. As I mentioned earlier, this man, Bakul, works with the Indian Foreign Service. Therefore, this is a family that frequently stays abroad in different countries. At this point in the novel, they are based in Washington, D.C., the capital of USA. And they are visiting Delhi for a short while as Americans. So the brothers in the Mishra household have a lot of questions for Bakul. And one question is about how Bakul talks about India to foreigners, or rather specifically to Americans. Now, this is an important scene for us because Anita Desai is in some sense similar to this character Bakul. Why? Anita Desai is not a diplomat. She does not work with the Indian Foreign Service. However, she does one thing that this diplomat also does, which is to talk about India to people who have never been to India. That is to say, the readers of Desai's English novels are based outside India. Many of them are Americans and English people who have never been to India and who will never travel to India. And yet, they are persuaded by the words that Desai writes. So Desai has this unenviable task of talking about India to people who know very little about India. So when these characters, the Mishra brothers, ask Bakul how he talks about India to foreigners, Desai, in some sense, is talking about how she thinks of her own duty as the English language writer. So when Bakul talks about his job as a diplomat as a duty, he mirrors that of the English language writer from India. Bakul says, "What I feel is my duty, my vocation when I'm abroad, is to be my country's ambassador. All of us abroad are, in varying degrees, ambassadors. I refuse to talk about famine or drought or caste wars or political disputes. I refuse. I refuse to discuss such things. No comment is the answer if I am given, if I am asked. I can discuss such things here with you, but not with foreigners, not in a foreign land. There I am an ambassador and I choose to show them and inform them only of the best, the finest." "The Taj Mahal?" asked Bem. "Yes, exactly," said Bakul promptly. "The Taj Mahal, the Bhagavad Gita, Indian philosophy, music, art, the great immortal values of ancient India. But why talk of local politics, party disputes, election malpractices, Nehru, his daughter, etc., etc.? These aren't important when compared with India, eternal India." Now, this is a very common tendency, not just in characters like Bakul, but also in the writings of many novelists like Anita Desai, but not Anita Desai. What I'm talking about is a tendency to talk about India as if it is eternal, as if nothing changes. You can find this tendency in the novels of many writers. They idealize and glorify a mystical and very exotic India. Why do they do this? They do this because many readers who are based outside India are like tourists. All they know about India are what they have seen in brochures and tourist videos and websites like TripAdvisor and Lonely Planet. For them, India is a land of temples, spicy food, and all of those stereotypes which are not very realistic. It is easy for many novelists to write about India in a convincing way by simply repeating those stereotypes. In this scene, the narrator of Desai's novel is very harshly criticizing those practices. The narrator is saying that other novelists should not be like this diplomat who never really understand what happens in India. They think India is eternal, is unchanging, like Indian philosophy and music and art, but rather they completely ignore what truly happens in India, which is the local politics, the party disputes, election malpractices, Nehru's daughter, and so on. Nehru's daughter is a very specific reference because this novel was published in 1980, 3 years after the emergency was imposed by Indira Gandhi, and there was a great tumultuous time in the history of this nation. Everyone knew that there were a lot of malpractices involving Nehru's daughter and grandson. So, this is a topical reference to events that were unfolding in the real world. Bimla provides a counter argument to what Bakul is saying. Bimla says, yes, it does help to live abroad if you feel that way. If you lived here, and particularly if you served the government here, I think you would be obliged to notice such things. You would see their importance. I'm not sure if you could ignore bribery and corruption, red tapeism, famine, caste wars, and all that. In fact, living here, working here, you might easily forget the Taj Mahal and the message of the Gita. She goes on to say, then it is definitely important to live abroad in the comfort and luxury of the embassy. It must be much easier, very easy to concentrate on the Taj or the Emperor Akbar. Over here, I'm afraid you would be too busy queuing up for your rations or juggling with your budget, making ends meet. This Bim agrees is an exaggeration, but she makes her point, as does the narrator of this novel, as does Anita Desai. The point is that from a distance, observers of India only see the big things like the Emperor Akbar or the Taj Mahal. But that makes for very unappealing viewing. Rather, that makes for a very uninteresting story. Because what happens really in India is not only the Taj Mahal and Emperor Akbar, but rather local and inconvenient things like corruption, red tapeism, famine, caste wars, and all of that. The true novelist, or rather the ideal novelist in Desai's view, is one who rises to the challenge of observing both the local and the global about India and finding a way to describe both the local and the global in a story about India. That would be what a truly Indian novelist would be able to do. Another key theme that the first part of the novel raises is the interrelation between three things, that is, the relation between memory, reading, and the labor of care. This intersecting relation between these three themes is brought up on the last page of part one of the novel, in which the two sisters, Bim and Tara, are reflecting on the past, and Bim tells Tara something very fascinating. Bim tells her that sometimes she sees the ghost of their aunt, who they knew as Meera Masi. Bim says that many days, for months and sometimes years after Meera Masi had actually died, Bim used to see the ghost of this person. Remembers the lines from a poem in order to describe how she felt about the visions of Meera Masi that she used to see. Bim then recites the lines which are written by T.S. Eliot. The lines go, "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, there are only you and I together. But when I look ahead up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you?" Seeing incomprehension on Tara's face, Bim provides Eliot's explanation of the origin of these lines. As Eliot notes, the lines in the wasteland were inspired by a passage titled "The Extra Man" from Sir Ernest Shackleton's memoir of his transatlantic expedition of 1914 to 1916. Shackleton's ship was stuck in pack ice for 5 months, and at one point a group of three, Shackleton and two of his men, marched for 36 hours to look for help across the glaciers of the South Georgia island. Shackleton recalls that all three men imagined there was a fourth in their group. Shackleton attributes this hallucination to acute loneliness, out of which Providence alone could have rescued them. Eliot adapts Shackleton's hallucination and the ends of the earth, but removes Shackleton's certainty about the providential rescue. By providing Eliot's footnote along with the quotation, Bimla reproduces Eliot's strategy of appropriating Shackleton. However, unlike Eliot, Bimla goes further and explains that even though she remembered those lines about lonely explorers who saw ghosts, she herself was not anything like these imagined speakers. In fact, Bimla was everything but lonely. Even while she cared for Miramasi, and even as Miramasi died, while she cared for her, Bimla had to provide care to other people. Raja fell sick, and Baba's autism came to the fore, therefore, Bimla became a full time carer. In response, Tara gave a small sigh that she disguised as a yawn. She had listened so often to Bim and Raja quoting poetry, and yet she herself was never the studious type. While Bim and Tara were people who always read books, who even as children always had their faces buried in books, they had a camaraderie which they had built by quoting and reciting poetry. Tara, on the other hand, was someone who was not interested in books. Tara was a less bookish child and often felt left out from the kind of community that Bim and Raja had built through their reading, through their mutual appreciation for literature, and through their frequent and repeated recitation of lines from books that they admired. So, in this scene, what the narrator describes to us is that even though some characters are not as fluent with these intellectual and academic sources, they still have a right to remember the past in different ways. So, I will briefly now wind up this lecture, and I will conclude the discussion of the significance of part 1 in the next lecture. But for now, I'll summarize very briefly what we've encountered so far. We've seen that this is a story about the past. All characters in this novel are struggling with the right way in which they should remember the past. How to remember the past is such an important question because it shapes the present and the future of these characters. The stakes are the highest for the protagonist Bimla because she has recently been insulted by someone who remembered the past in a way that was very different from the way she would like to remember it. Why does Bimla want to remember the past in a specific way? That is because Bimla was someone who was designated as a default carer. This kind of a labor was demeaning to Bimla's sense of herself as an individual. However, she also appreciated that she provided that labor out of a love for her family. So the problem was not the fact that she provided that labor, but rather how others thought that maybe she should provide that labor, or rather that being a woman or a daughter, it was somehow her natural or biological duty to provide that labor. That was frustrating to Bimla, and that is why she had cut off all ties with her brother. So, a lot turns on how people remember the past. This is a key theme that's established in part 1, as well as a hint of other themes, which is the relation between reading, remembering lines of poetry, and providing the labor of care. We will continue a discussion of these themes in the next lecture, as well as a conclusion and a detailed analysis of the significance of part 1 in the next lecture.